Hi all. Let's talk probability theory. Probability theory is the branch of mathematics that deals with randomness and uncertainty. The basic idea is that even in situations of uncertainty, we can still apply the logical tools of mathematics and derive rational conclusions about the likelihoods of various outcomes. That is, we can make deductively valid arguments about the probabilities and be sure of our conclusions, even though our conclusions will involve uncertainty. Let's look at roulette. Roulette is a common casino game with pretty standard rules. Here I'll stick to the American variant. In this version, a small ball falls into one of 38 slots on a wheel numbered 1 to 36, as well as a 0 and a double 0. Which slot it ends up in is, as far as possible, determined randomly, with each slot equally likely. There are many different bets that can be made, but unlike most other casino games, they all have the same house edge. What this means is that aside from concerns about minimum or maximum bets and any superstitions, there are no mathematical differences between the various bets. Because of this, we'll just look at a single bet on the 0. Other bets, ultimately, have the same mathematical result. To determine if betting on 0 is a rational decision, we'll calculate our expected winnings if we do so. Roughly speaking, the expected value of a random variable is its long-term average. So in this case, we want to know the average amount of money we'll win betting on 0. If our expected winnings are 0, then this would be a fair bet. If it is a positive amount, then it's biased in our favour. If it's a negative amount, then it's biased in the casino's favour. Every time you bet $1, there are two possible outcomes. Either we lose $1 or we gain $35. In an actual casino, you put your dollar on the table and either you don't get it back or you get $36 back, which is your original dollar and a gain of $35. So we either win $35 or we lose $1. To calculate the expected value, we need to know the probabilities of these two outcomes. There are 38 slots, which are all equally likely. One of them, the 0, results in a win, any of the others is a loss. Therefore, the probability of losing is 37 over 38, and the probability of winning is 1 in 38. This gives us enough information to calculate our expected winnings. To do so, we simply multiply each possible outcome by its probability and add them up. In this case, it's $35 times 1 over 38 minus $1 times 37 over 38, which is minus 1/19 of a dollar. That is, for every dollar bet, we expect to, on average, lose 1/19 of a dollar, or about 5 cents. This means that, as expected, the game is biased in the casino's favour. Therefore, if all we are concerned with is the monetary rewards of gambling, it would be irrational to play this game. There may be specific situations where it is reasonable to bet, but in general, the game is biased against us and we should choose not to play. Let's look at the problem of God. I am, of course, talking about Pascal's Wager. Blaise Pascal was a 17th century French mathematician and one of the first people to develop probability theory. Later in his life, he became a devout Christian, and his wager is an attempt to apply probability theory to the issue of belief in God. Now, Pascal's Wager has issues, but I'm frequently surprised with quite how badly it is presented by apologists. As a result, I think that many atheists have counter-arguments that are not very good. One issue that is often brought up is that of doxastic voluntarism. This is the question of whether we choose our beliefs or not. While this is an interesting philosophical question, it is only really relevant to a poor version of Pascal's Wager. It is generally accepted that we probably have sufficient control over our beliefs that if Pascal's Wager is compelling, we should be able to change our beliefs to match. But more importantly, Pascal's Wager need not be formulated as an argument for faith, but rather for piety. That is, many Christians would accept that a constant, absolute belief in God is likely impossible for many people, and that what is important is a commitment to trying to believe and to living in accordance with the faith. On this version, direct doxastic voluntarism is unnecessary and irrelevant. Pascal argued that since almost all reasonable people would accept that we can be sure of neither God's existence nor non-existence, this means we will always have some level of uncertainty on the issue. This means that determining what is rational will involve probability theory, and in fact, we can model our situation as an involuntary bet. That is, since we are alive, and the concept of God that we are presented with will punish us for impiety, we are forced to make a decision. We must choose to either strive for piety or not. This is analogous to being at the roulette table and being forced to bet. Our only choice is what to bet on. So, let's analyse our situation in the same way that we would analyse any other bet. Suppose that we decide to bet on God and act as piously as possible. What are our possible rewards and punishments? We'll assume that God will not intervene in our lifetime, and so, regardless of whether God exists or not, we will incur the same earthly costs. That is, unlike many apologists, we acknowledge that there are costs involved in being a Christian, and we will concede that even if God exists, there may be no earthly benefit to being pious. Now, we need to be able to quantify these costs, and that's hard to do objectively. So, like any good mathematician, we'll just call them C. Now, what will happen after death? Well, as every apologist likes to point out, if the atheist is correct, there will be no further costs or benefits. However, if the theist is correct, then there is some heavenly reward. Again, it's hard to quantify these benefits, so we'll just call them R. The last pieces of information we need are the probability that God exists and that God does not exist. We'll call the probability that God exists PG, and the probability that God doesn't exist PA. This gives us all of the quantities that we need, despite not actually assigning them numerical values. Let's calculate the expected value of our winnings for betting on God. The expected value, EW, is the reward if God exists, R minus C, multiplied by the probability that God exists, PG, added to the reward if God doesn't exist, minus C, multiplied by the probability that God doesn't exist, PA. Let's simplify this a bit. Since God either exists or doesn't exist, PG plus PA equals 1. So we can rearrange this as R multiplied by PG minus C. As we saw previously, a bet is biased in our favour if the expected value of the winnings are greater than 0. That is, when R multiplied by PG minus C is greater than 0, which is equivalent to R being greater than C divided by PG. We are justified in dividing by PG as long as it is not 0. That is, as long as it is possible, no matter how unlikely, that God exists. The important thing to notice here is the right-hand side of the inequality, C divided by PG, is a finite quantity. No matter how high the earthly cost of being a Christian, and no matter how low the probability that God exists, this quantity is some finite amount. So, for the bet to be biased in our favour, we need the possible heavenly reward, R, to be larger than this amount. But this will always be the case, since the promised reward is taken to be infinite, or at least larger than any earthly reward or punishment. So, no matter what the actual numerical values are, the mere nature of the heavenly reward, combined with the mere possibility that God exists, ensures that betting on God's existence is a rational bet to make, since it will always be biased in our favour. Now, everyone knows that Pascal's wager is flawed, so where have we gone wrong? You might suspect that I've done something tricky with the mathematics, but I assure you I haven't. The only incorrect reasoning I've used here is the usual equivocations that apologists use. The mathematics is all above board. So what's the fallacy here? Well, as always, I've equivocated on what it means for God to exist or not exist. When I claimed that the heavenly reward was potentially infinite, I relied on that God being the Christian God. But when I claimed that the cost of this God not existing were finite, I was relying on that meaning that no God exists. But this is a false dichotomy, as there aren't just the two possibilities, the Christian God exists or no God exists. So when I then claimed that the probability that God exists plus the probability that God does not exist is 1, I'm invoking this false dichotomy. The truth is that for Pascal's wager to work, we must factor in the probabilities for other gods existing. But then the costs associated with being wrong become potentially infinite, as we could be condemned to eternal torment in hell. The maths gets a little messier, but the end result is that we cannot determine if this is a fair bet without having a good sense about the relative likelihoods of each god existing or no god existing. This then renders the argument impotent, as it will always produce an answer that reflects the values put in. So the apologist will argue that their god is likely, and their numbers will match this. The atheist will argue that each god is unlikely, and their numbers will match that. What was supposed to be the strength of the argument, that no matter what numbers you choose, it's always a good idea to be pious, is utterly destroyed once one accounts for the possibility of other gods. Not that I expect this to be any surprise to anyone who's encountered Pascal's Wager before, but I wanted to present a more mathematical version than what is usually encountered. I hope you've enjoyed it. See ya.